Great. Thank you. We've been going through the some of the people in the Old Testament, portraits of the Old Testament. I'm not sure many of those people are in the Old Testament, but at least it's a picture. And dealing with the history that we've gone along we've got to the stage where the two lines separate, where the kingdoms, Israel divided into two kingdoms. Once, when Solomon died, the person his son who followed him, was asked by the people to say, look, we were heavily taxed to pay for the temple, can we have less? And his son, the king, did refuse to that. So the northern 10 tribes split off, and they became known as Israel, and then the southern tribes became known as Judah. The northern 10 tribes eventually got attacked by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were incredibly cruel people, and they obliterated them and took them away. So nobody really knows what happened to the 10 tribes. Well, there is one group that thinks they know, but they probably, they're called the British Israelites, and they probably have got a few things that we wouldn't want to believe in. So we were then left with the bottom, the southern two, which was called Judah. And what happened was that as God looked after them and as they followed the Lord, they prospered. When they turned away from God, and they just had a tendency to start to worship false gods and just to not follow what God wanted. And each time, eventually, he poured some sort of judgment on the land. And so eventually, he had warned them through the prophets. The Babylonians turned up to conquer them. So, and we're going to talk today about Daniel. And this is what happened this is the first couple of verses of the book of Daniel. So King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him, Nebuchadnezzar, victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah, and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of God. Now he also took a whole lot of people. Many of the population of the area of Judah were taken back to Babylon, and there were a few left, the stragglers, but they made sure that most of the people could come, because that was going to help the economy of the Babylonian Empire by having cheap labour that was there. That was in 597 BC, and then in 539 BC, Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquered Babylon, and he then started to allow the people to return to their land. And that happened over a period of time. Now Daniel was one who was taken to Babylon, and then the scriptures say he remained working with the king of Babylon and subsequent kings until the first year of King Cyrus. So that is the year that possibly Daniel came back to the promised land. But the thing was that people were relocated out of their land into this foreign land of Babylonia, and they didn't want to be there, but they had to be there because they were conquered and they were subject to the will of the king. You might have heard a song by Boney M that says, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion." Well, that's been around, song's been around a fair while now. And Zion, of course, refers to Jerusalem. So by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and we wept because we were not where we wanted to be, where our heart was, that is, back in Jerusalem. And so one of the guys who was taken was a young man called Daniel. And we have a book in the Bible called Daniel that writes about his experiences while he was in captivity and in exile in Babylon. And he was a young, gifted, godly man. The Babylonians had a tendency to give their own name to everybody, and so he was called Belteshazzar. But the scriptures don't really use that name, only mention it once in the book. It refers to him as Daniel, probably because he wrote the book and that he was there. One of the things that the king did was that from all these people coming into exile, he selected the cream of the crop, the smartest, brightest, most gifted younger people out of the people from Judah. He selected and placed them in the kind of specialist training school. And for 3 years, they were probably all men, I think, were all given the best place to live, the best food, the best education. At the end of 3 years, they were then subject to an examination by the king, who selected the best of them to go. And so Daniel, along with his 3 good friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all went into this finishing training school to be trained in anything. And the scriptures say that when they came out, they proved themselves so well that they were 10 times better than any of the Babylonian people who was in leadership and were seers and prophets of the land. And one of the things that really started at the very beginning, and this was evident all through his life, is that Daniel was a person who had godly values. And those values were strong within him. Am I moving away from your picture? Oh dear. Hi everybody, we're back now. And can we come over here more? Am I still in?
It's still in there.
It's still in there. Okay, and so when they were set up in this training school, they were to be given the best food and the best wine and the best everything that was there. For some reason, Daniel felt that the food and the materials that he was being fed by the Babylonians was defiled him. They may have been offered to idols. We don't know what the reason was, but he felt if he ate this, he would be defiled. And so, let's read the story. Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. And he asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. But the chief of staff responded, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. And if you become pale and thin compared with the other youths of your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded." Pretty vicious kind of job to have when that could happen. But they didn't want to do this. So Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's what they call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yeah. And he said, "Please test us for 10 days on the diet of vegetables and water." Daniel said, "And at the end of the 10 days, see how we will look compared with the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in the light of what you see. So he was refusing the food in the picture. And at the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for others. Now, this is not an advertisement for vegetarianism. This is simply a recognition that God, he was doing it in response to what he believed was the right thing to do as a godly young man. That somehow that food was going to defile him. And so he was able to push back against that and to refuse that and to have vegetables and water, which, maybe in some context, a bit like bread and water that they used to give people in prison. But for him, it worked. Now, a characteristic of Daniel was that he had a wonderful ability to interpret dreams and visions. And it seemed that God was using him and trying to speak to the nation and to the king in some ways through visions and dreams. And so King Nebuchadnezzar one night had a dream. He woke up quite troubled about this dream. There were a couple of problems with that. He didn't know what the dream meant, but that he couldn't even remember what the dream was. So he called his wise men along and said, I want you to tell me firstly what the dream was and then the meaning of the dream. And they understandably were a bit unimpressed with this kind of thing. And they said, well, how can we tell you what the meaning is if we don't know what the dream is? And the king wasn't prepared to do that. And he said, this is your last warning. All of you, the whole group of advisors and magicians and seers and prophets, if you can't tell me, then you're fakes and you will all be put to death. Now, Daniel was included in this group, and so his 3 mates came to him and said, Daniel, did you know that all of us are going to be killed? He said, why? Because the king wants us to interpret a dream, but he doesn't know what the dream was about, and he has no idea, so we have to come up with this. And Daniel was a man of God, and he said, no problem, tell him to give us a bit of time. And he just got before the Lord and prayed. And God gave him the dream, and then he gave Daniel the interpretation of the dream. And so so Daniel went home and told his friends what had happened. He urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secrets, so they would not be executed along with the other wise men. That night, the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision, and Daniel praised the God of heaven. And so he shared this with Nebuchadnezzar. The result was that King Nebuchadnezzar threw himself down before Daniel and worshipped him. You go, whoa, that's a bit unexpected, isn't it? But that's what the scripture said. And he commanded the people to offer sacrifices and burn sweet incense before him. That's Daniel. And the king said to Daniel, truly your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this secret to me. And the amazing thing is that kind of revelation that Nebuchadnezzar got didn't stay with him. He didn't then turn and commit his life to following God alone. He just recognized that of the gods that he has, that Daniel's God was probably the best of the bunch, but he still had the whole bunch there as well, which really isn't the way it should be. And there were many other times that Daniel interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar. There was a strange event that happened in Nebuchadnezzar's life, and then he had a psychotic episode where he just went nuts, and he was living out in the fields and eating grass. I don't know how that happened, because we do not have the ability to metabolize grass, but he managed to survive and then was restored back to his sanity again, and was able to come back. Now, in the book, Nebuchadnezzar then disappears, and a new king called Belshazzar comes, and that's thought to be Nebuchadnezzar's son. Maybe he wasn't king of the whole place. He might have been a regent, a king of one of the regions. But the story was that one night Belshazzar was having a party, and they got drunk, and they thought, look, we got some great gold globules in our store that we took back from Jerusalem. We pinched them out of the temple there. So why don't we bring those out and drink out of that, which they did. And then they got more drunk, and they began to worship other gods. And the party just went really south in terms of spiritual life. That this was something that God wasn't happy about. And so this amazingly unusual thing took place, that a hand appeared, just a hand, and began to write on the wall. And how would you feel if a hand simply appeared here and began writing words on the wall? That would be the scariest, freakiest kind of deal. And so these guys were pretty normal in their response. They were terrified. And so the words that were written were many, many tikul pasim. Now, nobody in the room knew what those words meant. And so Daniel, again, he was regarded as the guy who knew stuff that nobody else did. So he was called in to give a, and there is his understanding of the words. Many, many. God had numbered the days of your reign. This is the Belshazzar. And brought it to an end. Tikul, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And pasim, your kingdom is divided and given, that should be, to the Medes and Persians. And they, of course, were the enemies of Babylon. And the next verse says, that night Belshazzar died. Just and immediately in response. So God said to him, you have been wrong, you've been weighed in the balance, found wanting, your kingdom will be taken from you, and the Medes and the Persians will come in there. And so the Medes, one of the Medes, Darius, was the king who took over from Babylon as they conquered Babylonia. And that there was a kind of a link between them and the Persians, that they had a joint sort of thing about them. And so the scriptures say that Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. So he was going to be the sort of prime minister of the land. The other 120 high officers were not impressed with this possibility. They were jealous of Daniel, and so they decided on a plan that they had to get rid of Daniel in some way. So they approached King Darius and said, Darius, you are a wonderful man. You are worthy of all honor and praise, and we believe that there should be a period of time in the land when only you should be worshipped. No other gods shall be worshipped for 30 days. Just you, O king. And O king was quite impressed with this suggestion. It kind of tickled his ego. And so he made a law, the law of the Medes and Persians. Once they were set in place, it couldn't be changed. And he made the law and sealed it in wax with his ring. And it became such that nobody could worship any other god for 30 days. If they did, they would be cast into the den of lions. So what did Daniel do? He did that. But when Daniel learned about the law, that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with the windows open towards Jerusalem, which means the picture's wrong, there's no open windows. And he prayed 3 times a day, just as he always had done, giving thanks to God. So again, this is just an amazing commitment to the values of being a follower of God. That he didn't care what the outcome was. When someone said, I cannot worship my God, he said, I'm not going to obey that command. And so he used to pray 3 times a day with the windows open so that he could be seen from outside. And some of these other jealous so-called leaders saw this happening, rushed off to King Darius and said, guess what? Daniel is disobeying your command to worship no other god for 30 days. He needs to be cast into the den of lions. Now Darius had got to like Daniel quite a bit, and he tried to think, was there a legal way of getting around this? But there wasn't, because the law had been made, and there was no other way to change it. And so they cast Daniel into the den of lions, and the following morning, Darius was so concerned. He must have believed that God had some way, because he came and said, he called out, Daniel, has the Lord your God answered you? And Daniel answered, long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. There's a bit of a grisly afterpath of that, is that the guys who made the accusation to the king against Daniel replaced Daniel in the lion's den, and they didn't have such a happy end. And so that's the kind of situation that Daniel was. There are several stories in the book of Daniel that indicate that this is a man of God who followed godly principles and lived by godly values and wasn't prepared to compromise them at any point. He continued to have, because the last part of the book of Daniel consists of a number of dreams that Daniel himself had, and then God gave him the interpretation. In chapter 10 of Daniel, there's a fascinating little part where Daniel had a dream, and then he began to pray for the interpretation of this dream. And he prayed for 3 weeks. And 3 weeks later, the angel Gabriel appeared and said, oh, Daniel, hi, I've just come to answer your query about the interpretation of this dream. But when I left, I was waylaid by the spiritual powers of the king of Persia, and I've spent 3 weeks fighting them until the Archangel Michael came to give me a hand, and then we sorted them out, and I've been here now. So his prayer, he would have thought, why isn't God answering it? There was reasons in the heavenlies that were delaying that answer. And I guess that's something we don't take much account of in terms of wondering why our prayers are not always answered straight away. That they might be delayed for some other. One of the dreams that he had, it's intriguing that God gives him this dream, because he was then predicting the political situation of the known world in the coming centuries. And he had a dream of a ram which had 4 horns, and each of those horns related to one of the kings and one of the principalities that would come. And then in the dream there was a goat. So ram was a good one, the goat wasn't. And the goat referred to the kingdom of Greece. Alexander the Great, I've heard that story of him conquering the known world. And so this goat was predicted to rule the world for a period of time. And it deeply affected the land of Israel, because the people had come back from Babylon and had settled. They'd rebuilt the temple, rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, and were living in that land happily there. And then a pretty nasty Greek king conquered the land and conquered Jerusalem. And not only was he interested in conquering the place, he also wanted to exterminate the religion of the people of God, the Jewish religion. And so this king called Antiochus Epiphanes, he invaded the temple and desecrated the temple. And then the ultimate kind of thing in Jewish eyes that he could do in desecration was he sacrificed a pig, which was an unclean animal for the Jewish people. He sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple. And for them, that was the ultimate kind of desecration. The Jewish people got a bit brassed off with this, and so they had an uprising. And the Maccabees came along, and they formed an army which booted out Antiochus Epiphanes, or his son by that stage. But that was a very, very difficult and bloody time of the history of Israel. All of these things happened because of the way in which either they were following God or were not following God. And for some reason, this was all given in prophecy to Daniel. And so anybody who wanted to know, they could read the writings of Daniel and see what God was going to do. Isaiah and Jeremiah also had predicted the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem later on. So I could tell you other stories of the book of Daniel, but they kind of cover who he was and what drove him. That he was a man of God who for 60 years was held in captivity, but he honoured the place in which he worked. He did not oppose his captors, but as an expression of a godly man, did his best and received honour from those who captured him. He lived in a strange land. He must have wondered when would God send us back to our land? We had suffered enough, and yet he consistently lived by values. He was not willing to be distorted, to be put aside and then walked out any other way except the way that he believed God would have him. And one of the things that is right through the book is his captives blessed him. They recognized that he was a man who was right, righteous, of integrity, of character, a man who was driven by a higher belief, and that is the belief in God. I remember, and that wasn't easy to do. When he stood up right at the beginning and said, I do not want to eat this food, that was a courageous, Because if you stand against anything that Nebuchadnezzar wanted, he was the most powerful king probably who's ever lived. When you stood up against anything, you were dismissed and killed, put to death. That was the expression, that was what would be the normal thing that would happen. I remember when I was in Sunday school, there was a little chorus that we used to sing. Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose firm. And dare to make it known. And that I guess encapsulates some of what we learn about this man. That he had a purpose that he held on to firmly, and that was to be a person led by God. And that he dared to make it known. He dared to stand up against anything that he believed was evil and proclaim the goodness of God. He never conformed to the world around us, but he stood up and was willing to be counted by someone as a person who had principles that were really strong. And I wonder, in today's world, when people stand up for something they believe in, and particularly if it's in God's kind of way, that's not going to be accepted, that's not going to be believed. And so we have a choice how we live, whether we compromise in order to conform, or whether we stand for what God says. Now we can do the opposite. We can be so bigoted and silly and just believe that everything that I believe is true. But when we know that God has spoken to us, when we know that there is a standard that God has, that's not open for debate, then how we deal with that is an important part of our life. To be like Daniel, to stand alone, to have a purpose firm and make that purpose known. That we are able to see things, see God work through us in all kinds of ways. So I want you to just think about this question now. Like Daniel, you would want to live according to your Christian values. Where do you encounter pressure or to compromise those values? Where do you encounter pressure to compromise those values? So in your tables, can you just talk about that, and then we'll